So I want to pivot right now. I get the privilege of introducing our next speaker, and the reason I say privilege is because this is a leader that both embodies what it means to lead a large organization through cloud transformation, and because he has become one of the best customer partners that I've ever worked with at Rackspace across any product line, but certainly from the OpenStack space. Graham Peacock is the Vice President of Engineering at TD Bank. TD Bank is one of the 6 largest financial institutions in North America. They manage over $1.1 trillion in assets. They have 24 million customers, but perhaps more importantly, a little less than half of those customers are active online or mobile customers, which makes technology and the delivery of banking through technology very important for their business. So Graham is going to come up on stage, and he's going to share a little bit about their journey with OpenStack, the strategy that drove their adoption of this particular platform, a little bit about some of the positives of that journey along the way, as well as the challenges that they had to solve. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Graham Peacock from TD Bank.
Thank you, Darren. Good morning, everybody. Never quite sure what to wear at these things, but clearly I didn't get the memo on suits. So Darren walked through some of my first slide. Let me walk through the rest. The 2 graphics are kind of interesting. So 2003, TD was a Canadian bank. Right? The expansion into the US happened literally in the last 10, 12 years. And you can see from the number of green dots on the bottom graphic, how significant that expansion has been, to the point where we now have more branches in the US than in Canada. So we're a universal bank. We provide products in the business areas you see on the right-hand side. And we've grown to be the 6th largest bank in North America by market capitalization. So tremendous growth over the last 10, 12 years. And you can imagine the impact that's had on the technologies that we have in our data centers. Right? So the focus has really been on growing each business line independently and giving them as much autonomy as they need to be successful in those businesses. And it's clearly worked. So moving onwards a little bit, this is an old slide. So 18 months ago, we came up with this slide really to describe the direction we wanted to take with cloud. So we didn't really know what cloud was, but we wanted one. We knew we weren't ready for public cloud. We knew that would be too much of a step from our regulators, from our legal, from our compliance, from our risk colleagues. So we wanted to start with private cloud. We know we needed relief in our data centers, and we knew that eventually we would get to public cloud. Therefore, we didn't want to build more data centers, right? So we wanted a partnership that would provide an off-premises development cloud, so move the development workload out of our data centers, keep production workload on our premises in our data centers for the time being. We wanted a fully managed infrastructure service, so we know there's people out there that can manage infrastructure much better than we can, and a much bigger scale than we can, and that's how we entered into partnership with Rackspace. Platform as a service, though, is far less mature. It was always going to be far more difficult for us just trust somebody else to manage the platform component for us. We're a bank. We build our own hardened operating system. We build our own hardened middleware databases. It's very hard to move that into a PaaS service vendor at this point in time. Tosca was the only really open solution that we could find 18 months ago that would allow us to, in an open, reasonably future-proof way, orchestrate our platforms into the infrastructure as a service provided by Rackspace. We liked Docker a lot, but until very recently, Docker was really only available for RHEL. Windows 2016 Server, which is still in beta, I believe, will provide Docker and Kubernetes, but not yet. And we know that as more and more infrastructure becomes software, the skill sets that we have internally changes. We stop buying and dropping boxes on the data center floor. We become programmers, right? So infrastructure becomes software, and inevitably that means our jobs change, and we move further and further up the application stack. We start providing services as APIs to the development teams to make their job easier. So 18 months ago, that was the vision. In October 2014, we signed a contract with Rackspace. By December that year, we'd built a development environment, had it up and working. But getting ready for cloud was complex. So, mention cloud internally, you literally get expressions like those in that graphic. What is cloud? Why do I need one? Do I have to? We're a large company. There's 10,000 people in technology, and they're very used to working for a single business line, running project after project, delivering into a production environment. We've also been a very buy rather than build kind of culture. We trust vendors to provide solutions to us. We do a little bit of integration. We do the support work. But cloud was something very, very new for us. As I said, we stood up a development cloud by mid-December. The adoption component was rather harder, right? So it literally required us to run a fairly significant training program continuously. And it's about finding developers, making them attend training, making them learn, right? There's a natural apprehension to taking on things that are new, that you don't understand, right? People are more comfortable doing what they've been doing. So the training program was important. So from December, when we stood up the cloud, through to March, we trained over 3,000 developers in the bank. It was a continuous process. And we ran that in parallel as we were building out the production cloud, right? So we allowed developers into the environment before we'd finished building it. So a lot of patterns that we came up with, a lot of training material we came up with. We created an environment where it's easy to experiment. That was the development environment on day one. Yeah? Here's a lot of capacity sitting off premises with Rackspace. You use it to play, to look at the patterns we want you to use to experiment, and to figure out how to become more self-sufficient yourselves within each business line. We built a professional services team effectively within the infrastructure team to provide developer support on a continuous basis, right? So hand-holding became part of what we have to do. Adopting cloud is complex. Understanding how to write a Tosca blueprint to stand up your infrastructure, deploy the platforms you require, ultimately release your application onto those platforms, it's a non-trivial task. So that's what we worked on for the period really from January through to June, July last year. So by July, we built the production cloud, rather more complex than the development cloud. And by September, we had our first production application. So end-to-end, about a year, pretty rapid progress. But that was the way that we had to approach the journey, right? So winning the hearts and minds of the development teams across the bank and actually encouraging them, nurturing them, helping them adopt cloud and understand how to move their applications into an environment that was very, very different from the one that they'd worked with previously. In terms of achievements in the last year, I think it's reasonably obvious. Our previous infrastructure design process was pretty manual. You wanted a server, then explain to me what kind of server, what you're trying to do with it, how many CPUs, how much memory, how much disk. The design process for infrastructure was cumbersome. It took a very, very long time. As you can see, 119 steps to go through the infrastructure design process before we're ready to order the hardware. Now, bear in mind that cloud adoption isn't a lift and shift, right? So a lot of the applications we have running on cloud are effectively running as hybrid. They've got a component off cloud, they're running a component on cloud, right? It's very, very hard to move a distributed environment and all the middleware, all the services, all the databases to cloud in one hop. So if you look at the next two stats, there's still some non-cloud design steps, but significantly reduced. And for cloud, there's actually just 2 steps. And they're simple reviews to make sure that the work that's been done by the development teams is fit for purpose, there's no security weaknesses, they're not doing anything that they shouldn't be doing. And I think those 2 steps will be reduced over time as the development teams get better, at deploying applications to cloud. So in terms of time, clearly the elapsed time from the way that we used to work to the way that we now work, gone down from at least 15 weeks down to less than 4. Kind of re-emphasized with this stat, so the development environment is entirely self-service. Higher environments aren't, and that's that review process that I mentioned. We don't really want development applications being promoted into production by the developers, so there's some review processes there. But clearly, we're down from 100 days to deploy into production to a couple of days. Cost savings, so fairly dramatic. So compared to the way that we used to build physical servers or even virtual servers, to the way that we now build them and deploy them on cloud, we're seeing a 25% to 40% cost savings. We've actually only put 7 platforms on cloud, right? So previously, the way that the bank used to work, individual project teams made decisions as to which technologies they would use. They crept into the data center. We actually have well over 1,000 different platforms in our data centers. We made a decision a year ago to only put 7 into cloud. So if you want instantaneous infrastructure, use the technologies we want you to use. If you want to go and use something else, do it, but you're stuck in the old mode, right? Go back to using 119 design steps and waiting 3 to 6 months. So that's had quite an impact on reducing and consolidating the technologies that we're supporting. Cloud is a much simpler environment in terms of the diversity of technologies we have. Building out the platform as a service layer was complex, right? We went the open source route. The 7 technologies we chose to orchestrate platforms into the infrastructure were open source, so they had 56 dependencies, right? So the open source hierarchy is significant. So we introduced quite a lot of complexity sitting within the infrastructure team because of the open source approach we took to PaaS. This is an interesting one. So previously, getting a log file out of the production environment took a couple of days, unless it was related to a major production outage. The development team had to create a ticket, wait for the operations team to get around to it. Ultimately, if the log file was still there, you'd get it back via email. So we now have that as, as self-service. We put something like 130,000 hours into building out the PaaS layer in the year that I mentioned. So quite a significant task. The layer has about 200,000 lines of code. Yeah, and as I said, we chose the open source route because there was no proprietary solution, no package solution that really did the job for us. And in terms of the business case, how we funded the cloud build, we predicted something like 2,000 or 3,000 VMs per year for 5 years. By Christmas 2015, we actually had over 4,000 VMs running. So we're significantly outstripping the business case that we put together to justify the build-out of cloud, right? Clearly driven by the self-service nature of cloud, development teams have far more ability now to spin up a VM independently than they ever had, which means they're actually starting to use production-like workloads in the development environment. If they need 10 VMs to run a particular test case, they can create them themselves immediately. They can tear them down as soon as they're finished. They get charged for the amount of time they have them, not for the next 5 years of the hardware. So very, very different paradigm. So I think significant achievements delivered in a very short amount of time, in partnership with Rackspace as an infrastructure provider. I want to talk a little bit about maturity. So I think everybody's probably familiar with the kind of software development S-curve. When you're starting a new build, an application, you start off at the left, you've got no code, very small team, no customers. You can actually move very, very quickly. As you start moving up the curve, you start to acquire code. Team gets bigger, you acquire more customers, things slow down. So you go through the kind of innovation phase, you start to scale, you start to productize, you start to commoditize. Now, I think where we are with cloud is kind of here, right? We've been at it for 18 months. I think we know what we're good at. We know what we need to do. We've scaled the product far beyond the original business case that we put together. We have far more adoption than we expected. We have a cloud-first strategy within the bank, right? So you have to make a reason, and persuade me to deploy an application to a non-cloud environment. But we don't just have one architecture. Right? So cloud is the current infrastructure strategy. Previously, we were, sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen. Let's catch up. So cloud is here. Okay, wrong version of the deck. So let me talk to the change I made yesterday. So we're there with cloud. Prior to cloud, for the past 10 years, we were building towards a service-oriented architecture, right? So we spent a lot of calories building out that kind of design. We have 4,000 applications currently running in a service-oriented architecture. It's a little bit further up the maturity curve. So there should be a second star there, towards the top of the product box, not quite at the commodity box. Before distributed architecture, we had Mainframe, right? We run a lot of the Canadian retail business on Mainframe. Yeah, that's a little bit further up the curve, right? It's been around longer, it's more mature, it's more of a commodity, it's got a much more robust process around it. So what we have effectively is 3 generations of architecture running concurrently, within the environment. So we have 3 different S-curves, right? With applications at 3 different maturity points within the environment. And none of those are going away, right? Mainframe's been around for a very, very long time. We aren't going to fund $1 million program or a $10 million program to lift and shift everything from mainframe to cloud. Yeah? Life doesn't really work that way. The same with the distributed environment. Yeah? When those applications begin to change or begin to require significant upgrades, we'll then drop them on cloud. But until they require significant investment, it's hard to make the case for doing that. So we're living in a world that has those environments, those different architectures running concurrently. And when we add public cloud, there'll be a 4th, right? We'll have mainframe, we'll have a service-oriented architecture running on a distributed platform, we'll have private cloud, we'll have public cloud. Which really leads to this slide. There's a lot of talk in the industry about bimodal strategies, about greenfield, brownfield. But it's not really as binary as that. Right? It's not around new and old or good and bad. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we have 3 different concurrent architectures which we're supporting and still releasing applications to. And if we add public cloud, that's 4. So, it's not like we have a tap that we can turn off. I'd also argue that, bimodal, implying that everything beneath the dotted line is the old way of doing things, everything above the dotted line is the new way of doing things. I would also argue that the applications we have, the 4,000 applications we have today, were actually built by relatively small teams in partnership with the business, using a very agile methodology, and deployed in a very isolated fashion with few users on day one. Yeah? Over the 10 years they've been in production, they've grown into something rather larger, far more customers, far more code, far bigger teams, far more geography. Right? So naturally they've flipped to working in a more waterfall kind of paradigm. Right? Things slow down. So I think bimodal is misleading. I think when you look at decommissioning applications, it's very, very hard. You can replace the user interface relatively easily, but that's just pushing the application back to a service. Making a business case to replace the service is harder, but then all you're doing is pushing the service back and leaving the database, right? So actually decommissioning existing applications layer by layer is very, very hard, and it's not nearly as simple as some of the conversations in the industry imply. So next slide really is the world that we're living in today. So we're moving out of the bricks and mortar space, right? So we don't control the data centers because data centers are becoming virtual and moving to private or public cloud. So it's very, very hard for us to dictate to a development team that you have to use this server, this database, right? The Amazon catalog is extensive, right? Why would we prevent them from using anything in the Amazon catalog? So I think the role of an infrastructure team is changing. So the 4 boxes, the 4 boxes we talked about previously, clearly we're maintaining the mainframe environment. We aren't going to run a major program to decommission it. Doesn't make sense. The distributed environment is one we've been investing in for 10 years. Yeah? A lot of those applications will move over time to private cloud. Yeah? So we can contain it, we won't grow it, but it'll take a very long time to move those apps naturally to a cloud environment. So, we'll be deploying applications in both those directions for quite a long time. Clearly with the cloud-first strategy, sorry, the animation is not working very well, but with the cloud-first strategy, we're directing a lot of applications, new ones, major changes to existing ones, to the private cloud. So that yellow dot should be moving much more quickly than the rest. Right? As we innovate, as we start looking towards public cloud, we'll start directing applications there. So the role of an infrastructure team changes, right? So the govern box is intended to depict that. So really, the relationship that I have with the development teams across the bank is really one of helping them understand what the requirements are and directing their application workload to the most appropriate venue, right? If they're better off going to the existing distributed estate, then they should do that. If they're better off going to a private cloud, they should do that. Ultimately, further down the road, they shouldn't care, right? So the challenge we have is that we're not really working in a bimodal, greenfield, brownfield kind of environment. You know, clearly, we're going to be working in a trimodal, quadmodal environment for quite some time. And you know, there's not really one operations pane of glass across those venues, right? They're supported in very, very different ways. You build and release software to them in very, very different ways. You can't easily orchestrate an application to each of those 4 venues, you know, in the same way, right? So effectively, we are running in 4 very, very different modes at very, very different speeds. Okay, so in terms of what's next for TD, so we originally thought public cloud was at least 5 years away. We spent a very, very hard year building private cloud. As soon as we finished that, the bank now understands private cloud, understands some of the risk around public cloud. So all of a sudden, we've now made a commitment to running 3 pilots and breaking the back of the public cloud problem this year, right? So the challenge here is really going to be around compliance, legal, regulatory, getting to the point where we understand all of the risks and the sort of workload that we want to deploy to a public cloud vendor. The first thing we're going to do is, you know, put in place a layer of abstraction at the network layer. So to date, every B2B vendor that we use is a fixed line connection directly into our data center. So there's a lot of hard work to lay in that connection. And there's a number of point of presence providers around the world that are more conveniently located next to some of the cloud vendors. And they already have connections into those POPs. So we're going to plumb in a number of POPs into our network and making cloud connectivity, you know, virtually instantaneous for us. We're still going to stay with the infrastructure as a service model. We don't think we're ready for platform as a service, at least not as delivered by a public cloud vendor. Right? We still have a requirement to build our own hardened operating system image, our own hardened database image, to make sure that the cloud is running that image rather than somebody else's. So we think it'll take another couple of years before we're ready to choose the Amazon platform over our own. Right? So we'll start off with IaaS. We've proven that model works with private cloud. We'll continue building the platform as a service layer ourselves. But this time, we're going to make Docker a prerequisite. Right? So Docker wasn't quite ready 18 months ago, didn't provide the Windows support we expected. Now it's getting there. So we're going to move a lot of the complexity we built in those lines of code we developed over the last 18 months out of the way. Right? Orchestrating individual platforms into the cloud one by one is really hard. We're going to use Docker to make that problem much simpler. So that's really where we're heading, where we've come from, and the challenges that we see in the industry. So that's the end of the presentation. If anybody has any questions, happy to take them offline if you find me, you know, wandering around the floor. Otherwise, I'll hand back to Dan.